So Siobhan, you guys all right, everyone, if you could make your way back into the auditorium, keep us on time. All right, everyone. Well, just one post-lunch administrative item that I meant to mention earlier, and that is, as those of you who are veterans of the forum know, we literally begin planning for the next forum at the conclusion of this forum. So we're going to start that process tomorrow, Sunday, and as part of that process, we distribute each year a survey that we ask each attendee to complete, and our experience has been that nearly everybody does that, which, needless to say, is enormously helpful to us in planning for next year. So you should have this yellow form on your table, so please take a minute before you leave tonight or tomorrow to complete it, and there should be drop boxes there in the back for this purpose, or you can give it to any one of our team members. So with that, let's proceed with our next panel, the military and intelligence out of the shadows. Even those who are, I think it's fair to say that even those outside government who consider themselves to be intelligence junkies tend to know relatively little about the Defense Intelligence Agency, and this session is intended to remedy that for anybody in the audience who fits into that category. And to moderate this session, we have, fortunately, Siobhan Gorman, an old friend of mine who is a reporter for the Wall Street Journal covering terrorism, counterterrorism, cybersecurity, and intelligence issues. Prior to being at the Journal, which she joined in 2007, Siobhan was a Washington correspondent for the Baltimore Sun, where likewise she covered these issues, and before that she was a staff correspondent for National Journal. With that, Siobhan Gorman.
Great. Well, thank you so much for persevering after lunch on such a beautiful day. I'm impressed that you all are willing to join us. So thank you for your time. And we're going to have a great discussion today, certainly going into issues of military intelligence, but I also want to tap David's vast experience just throughout the intelligence community at CIA and the Director of National Intelligence, as well as DIA. So we'll talk military intelligence, we'll kind of take a tour around the world and maybe talk some broader intelligence community stuff as well. First, a little bit about David. He's been steeped in the intelligence world for more than 30 years. He started out at CIA, where he spent a fair amount of time overseas in places like Costa Rica and Mexico, and later moved on to top management posts. He spent 4 years at the National Security Council, and that's where he was on 9/11. He later landed the portfolio managing the White House's implementation of the recommendations of the 9/11 Commission, as well as the WMD Commission, which looked into the intelligence failures around the Iraqi weapons of mass destruction. One of his top responsibilities in that position was working with Congress on legislation to address those recommendations, including the creation of the Director of National Intelligence. He then ventured over to that newly created office, where he became Chief of Staff and later moved on to become the DNI's Deputy for Policy. There he led a number of efforts, like the rewrite of the executive order that defines responsibilities for each intelligence agency and a number of other major intelligence policy issues. He is now Deputy Director of the Defense Intelligence Agency, where he's focused on directing the agency's collection programs, its internal technology, and the unenviable task of trying to balance the budget and meet the demands of sequesters and furloughs and the like. So David, thank you so much for joining us. I'll start with kind of a broad question looking ahead. There's been quite a discussion of what the military is doing sort of post 2014 with the drawdown in Afghanistan and things like that. And I'm wondering, particularly from DIA's perspective, what does military intelligence look like when the battlefields, at least the conventional ones, are gone? What becomes your niche?
That's a great question. I live by the adage that left to their own devices, bureaucracies will always choose failure over change. Think about that. And for me and for Lieutenant General Mike Flynn, who leads alongside of me the Defense Intelligence Agency, the goal is to take the lessons learned informed by the past decade of Iraq and increasingly from Afghanistan, applying those lessons learned. Let me give you three that immediately come to mind. The first and foremost lesson that we're taking away from that is that there is an increasingly blending of the tactical with the strategic intelligence to inform decision making. And the decision maker, in order to have the kind of decision advantage and the weight of that decision advantage by way of the weight that you give to that decision. That is, tactical information collected on the battlefield helps inform national decisions, and the national collection means certainly contribute to a better understanding of the nature of the threat well beyond Afghanistan in 2014. The second lesson learned that I take from the past decade is that the closer you can bring the customer or user of that information, oftentimes in the case of the Defense Intelligence Agency, that being the warfighter, the combatant commander, to the intelligence collector, the one who does the analysis of that information, the better. That is, we have shortened the timeline between the collection and the time of the decision maker making some kind of use of that information in terms of that. And I certainly believe that well into the coming years, as we look at the world in crisis in a number of places, those lessons learned really do apply to that. And finally, our customers want the information faster and available to them in a matter of sometimes minutes or hours, and are very impatient quite often in terms of the gap between the time it's collected and analyzed and provided to them. And I think that is something that in a very practical way we have taken away from both Iraq and Afghanistan, but will have an application to the situations that we face in North Africa today, in the Levant, in the Korean Peninsula, wherever it might be.
Can you think of an example, say, where you are kind of reapplying those that show some, the unique contribution that DIA would be bringing, or the unique perspective?
The presence with what are the J2s, the intelligence elements of the combatant commands, is a place that DIA is heavily involved in terms of providing the four-star commander in providing that information in closer to real time, giving that commander through that J2 and the Joint Intelligence Operation group that works under that J2, the ability to reach back to DIA, and also us placing officers and analysts side by side with those operators in the J3, which is the operational side of those commands, as well as the J5 on the planning side. And so we're doing a lot more of a turnaround of analysts and operators sitting side by side with them in what I would term, from my background with CIA, the field, as opposed to sitting in Washington and studying the problem. And while great expertise might be brought to it, may be disconnected from the realities of what that combatant commander needs.
Does the type of information that you're going to be focusing on change? I mean, you're not in the middle of a heated battle, so it's not, real time is important, but there may be other elements to it if you're not literally in the heat of fighting all the time. That's what I'm trying to understand, is sort of what role DIA then plays if you're not in a hot war.
I think if you look around the world, there are in many countries a very significant role by those countries' militaries or their defense establishment. And to the degree that DIA contributes to understanding plans and intentions, command and control, order of battle associated with those governments, and the portion of that is the military or the defense establishment, that information is critical to our decision makers, whether in the White House, whether in the Pentagon at the Secretary of Defense level or the Chairman of the Joint Staff, or to the combatant commander on a regular basis, and I see that routinely. If you will, our job is to be able to meet those requirements and demands that they have. Their job is to let us know where those gaps or their requirements are in order for us to adjust to it.
You were talking about making change at DIA, and one of the big ones that you and General Flynn have been doing is the announcement of the Defense Clandestine Service and getting that off the ground. What's the status of that?
Defense Clandestine Service is a rework of really over 20 years of the Defense Intelligence Agency having a defense human intelligence capability that after 2 wars, or certainly coming out of Afghanistan by 2014, capacity capabilities would be applied to a much more traditional national defense set of requirements in terms of the Defense Clandestine Service. The operative word for Mike Flynn and myself, for DIA, and frankly the broader community, is integration. The strength of what I see by way of the Defense Clandestine Service, without getting into the details of its makeup and so forth, which are classified, I can tell you is working side by side with our CIA and FBI colleagues is a much better outcome than us working it separately.
So how are you preventing that overlap or the potential to work at cross purposes?
I am relying on John Brennan, who currently fills the chair as the director of the CIA, as the national human manager to really identify and define what those human intelligence requirements are. And we have somewhere on the order of 250, 275 requirements that are not being met by a, shall we say, a sister service. And so it's really about working those requirements together that otherwise would not be covered, but that have been identified as important to the services, to the combatant commands, to Special Operations Command in particular in terms of their role. And I know that you've heard from Bill McRaven from the Special Operations Command and Joe Votel. And it's really working that side by side with them in terms of their requirements.
So what would be an example of some of the requirements that would uniquely fit for DIA as opposed to one of the other intelligence agencies?
Well, I come right back to what is the mission of DIA. DIA's strategic mission is to prevent surprise. Its capabilities are directed and focused on those capabilities that would do us harm from adversaries, but uniquely focused again in the area of defense and military capabilities that those nations may have. So the collection requirements that best suit us are those collection needs that the services have and that DoD more generally has that need to be met that otherwise wouldn't be met. So in other words, understanding command and control of an adversary's country, their weapon systems, and so forth. Some of it actually quite technical.
That makes sense. Moving on a little bit more to issues going on around the world, there's certainly been a fair amount of discussion about Afghanistan, and I know that you bring unique expertise to that arena, having watched it from different positions. I'm wondering sort of what your assessment is of where the Afghan security capabilities are at this point, and sort of what you expect them to look like in a year or so when it becomes a pretty important thing for them to be up to speed on.
I believe we will be faced with some extraordinary challenges in terms of the Afghan National Security Forces, police, and so forth, armed forces as well as police, in the sense that their capabilities will certainly far better developed over the last several years, remain challenged by way of a very important, again, major lesson learned that we've had over the past decade and beyond, which is the fusion of intelligence and effectively getting that intelligence to the battlefield and acting on it. And so for that reason, I think that Afghanistan will have some very significant challenges. Now, on the positive side of the equation, I actually believe that we oftentimes do not give the ANSF the kind of credit that it does deserve. It is taking, they are not running from the enemy quite often, and they are taking on in the battle space some very significant actions with us being completely in the rear already.
What does their capability look like a year from now, do you think?
Maybe a better question is 2 to 3 years from now.
Fine, that's fine,
Or
yeah.
2 to 5 years from now. I think it will erode, and I think the agreement of the bilateral security agreement that is negotiated with them in terms of the train and equip is going to be a critical one, not only for the United States, but also for our allies who are committed to that assistance to the ANSF. I am very concerned that if it would go to zero, there would be a much greater fallback to the old ways and the challenges that we've seen with the Afghan military forces and police. I will say, I think the other big challenge is the political transition in Afghanistan as well, is something that we need to watch very, very carefully. The credibility of next year's elections and all of that, I think that transition is going to be absolutely vital for the standing of the transition from President Karzai to his successor in the April timeframe.
Moving on to a slightly newer conflict, I wanted to get some of your thoughts on Syria as well. I know that you've spent a fair amount of time tracking the opposition, and I'm wondering if you could maybe give us a lay of the land in terms of, what the key components are, particularly from your perspective, as well as how the composition of the opposition has evolved over the last year or two.
I think that Syria poses for us one of the biggest challenges in the Middle East, and in particular in the Levant, in that as some have termed it, if the Arab awakening and the Arab Spring was largely outside of Syria about implosions, Syria is explosive. I think we currently have the makings of a very critical war between the Sunni and Shia. I think the challenges that we face in terms of unfathomable violence is yet to come. I am very concerned about Jordan. I'm very concerned about Iraq and the fallout of any outcome, actually, in terms of Syria. I am concerned about Jordan. And so as I look across those countries, I think if Bashar Assad were to succeed, he will be a more ruthless leader who will live with a legacy of tens of thousands of his civilians killed under him. If he loses and, let's pretend, goes to an enclave inside there, I think there will be ongoing civil war for years to come. And I would be most concerned about Lebanon falling next.
In terms of the composition of the opposition, so sort of give us a little bit of a who's who. How big a concern is al-Nusra sort of within that, and who else are we talking about?
I count no less than 1,200 disparate groups in the opposition. And so to a large extent, the conditions of Syria benefit those who have a tendency toward or are actually in the far extreme. Because what happens is they go for the space and organization and certainly what they view as their mission vis-a-vis the Bashar Assad regime and its proxy fighters with Hezbollah and so forth. They are the most effective end of that spectrum of those 1,200 groups. They are increasingly stronger within the opposition in their relative capabilities against the regime. That is not a statement on the flow and the ebb that pertains to how the regime is doing against the opposition. But within the opposition, I think to your question, I think the al-Nusra front is gaining in strength and is a case of serious concern for us. Should be.
What are the other elements of the opposition that pose concern, or is that really the singular focus?
There is, I think it's widely known, somewhat of a divide between the al-Nusra front inside of Syria and the al-Qaeda Iraq elements and the leadership of Zawahiri on directing that. I actually tend to downplay those differences, and I believe that Al-Qaeda Iraq will emerge stronger as a result of its experience inside of Syria and in its return to Anbar in the greater Iraq in terms of taking back the battle-hardened lessons learned from the fight there. And as a result, I believe that left unchecked, and then that gets into the policy arena as to what to do about it, but left unchecked, I'm very concerned that the most radical elements will take over larger segments of those who are of those 1,200 groups interested in potable water in their village or have very local grievances against the regime.
How big a factor is Central Al-Qaeda in all of this in terms of the degree that they do connect up with al-Nusra or others?
Well, Zawahiri, as the leader of the senior leadership of Al-Qaeda, from the Fatah or from certainly in that area of the world, is providing certainly spiritual direction to the fight by calling it the epicenter of their fight. And as a result, I believe he does play that role and has been far more active publicly in engagement with the leadership of the Syrian Al-Qaeda, either direct or affiliate elements that are there.
People too, though? I mean, sending...
Yes, there's a flow of fighters into Syria that come from that side of the world.
So given how complex this opposition is, what's our ability to discern the good guys from the bad guys? How would you assess that?
Very difficult, but I think a challenge that is well worth pursuing because of, contrary to inaction, I think the situation, and certainly from an intelligence perspective, we would believe it will only grow worse over time. Is DIA contributing, at least presumably, to the intelligence picture for the assessments for things like vetting the opposition or, providing weapons, things like that? What's DIA's role with that? DIA is doing its job. Side by side, see, you thought I was going to stop there. Side by side with Central Command, with Special Operations Command, in terms of always thinking about planning and giving the president as many options, but based on a baseline understanding of what those options are. And that is not to suggest that any of them are easy or clear.
Are any of them good?
No.
Okay, just clarifying. From an intelligence perspective, as the U.S. becomes more invested in what's going on in Syria, how does it avoid getting completely sucked into a civil war? Because that's something that legislators have raised as a big concern.
It's a complex problem that I believe relying on allies in the region is probably our best solution. We know that a number of the Gulf states have grave concerns with the Bashar Assad regime. And I think that there are a number and a sizable number of allies that would be prepared to work even more closely with us pertaining to the Syria problem.
Moving, I guess, across the world a bit, DIA was in the news not too long ago for its aggressive assessment on North Korea and its ability to weaponize a missile. And I'm just wondering if you could explain for us how it is that DIA comes up with an aggressive assessment and then, finds that maybe that's not the consensus view within the intelligence agencies, and just sort of how that works within the intelligence community and who's right.
DIA, of course.
Right.
No,
Yeah.
just kidding. One thing that I learned as a very valuable lesson out of the Iraq WMD Commission report was that one of the things that is a grave mistake is to push for consensus where, assuming everyone has access to the same information, there are alternative views based on that information. Comes as no surprise that it's very difficult to get good, hard, and well-trusted information out of North Korea. However, so a lot relies on assessing on the basis of related activities that would allow you to make a judgment that may be in contrast to another intelligence community member, CIA, State Department's INR, or wherever it might be in terms of the all-source analytic line. What I have found in my now 31 plus years is that every customer or user of that intelligence is very anxious actually to hear where there are differences, rather than a consensus answer that somehow brings in the lowest common denominator. They want to know, again, on the basis of good analytic tradecraft, on the basis of everyone having the same access to the information in order to make those judgments, the ability to make that determination based on other factors that are germane to that agency's experience, knowledge, and so forth, that comes out with a judgment. We're talking about gradations of not reliability of the information, but the weight of the judgment that's being made. And I think that is not only a good thing, it points to a healthy intelligence community when you have that.
Yeah. One of the other things, obviously, that came out of the intelligence reforms was a lot of this sort of introspection and a tendency toward more reflection about, well, you know, how can you do analysis better and things like that. My sense is that there was a fair amount of that soul searching that went on in the wake of the Arab Spring, saying, you know, why were we so surprised by this? And I'm wondering what lessons you took away from that experience.
I think we have, and we will continue to still struggle with the ability to understand where there is a brittleness associated with the conditions on the ground that lead to an uprising or a break, as we saw with the Arab Spring. I think we had long judged that in the case of Egypt, for example, and a political transition from President Mubarak to potentially his son, that wasn't decided, was not going to be well received. The struggle that the intelligence community has, and particularly in a world where the social media further helps inform, does not give the outcome, but it does help inform potential outcomes, is something we have to better assess and be able to evaluate in terms of its significance and the weight that it gives to the popular feelings on the street, so to speak. And I think that is probably the single biggest lesson learned, that's another factor that is changing in terms of what we look at.
How are you looking at social media differently, or are you just giving it more weight? How is that now factoring into the thinking?
We are in the, I would love to say we have arrived at a place on how to deal with social media. When we look at the events that occurred just a few weeks ago in Brazil, a vibrant democracy, yet it filled the streets in numerous Brazilian cities, for example. That was a surprise that the backlash in terms of corruption and everything else would be taken to the Brazilian streets. So as we look at it, I think there's been a tendency to go too far and say it will give you categorically the outcomes. And it's moving back to it will help provide indications of warning if you're able to aggregate that data and are able to understand it and analyze it in such a way that, informed by other strains or streams of information provided, contribute to the understanding of the street.
Yeah. Actually, speaking of aggregating data, one of the things that was interesting to me as I've looked at how intelligence agencies are dealing with kind of this deluge of data is that it sounds like Afghanistan actually became a little bit of a proving ground or a testing ground for this whole concept of how you use big data in a meaningful way. And I was wondering if you could kind of walk us through the way that Afghanistan, intelligence agencies and like DIA were tapping a whole array of data about what was going on there to try to, at points, actually predict events, predict potential attacks, or at least the dynamics that might lead to something like that.
As one of the lessons that I already referred to in terms of the fusion of data that we've learned in Iraq and then really continued to refine in Afghanistan is that the idea of having any single stream of intelligence collection solely give you the whole picture is generally a thing of the past. And what the Kandahar Fusion Center, which is what you're referring to in terms of DIA's very active role in fusing intelligence from all sources, from open source all the way to clandestinely collected, into providing the warfighter the requisite decision-making information in order to disrupt an IED network, improvised explosive device network, or the actual attack is a proving ground. That said, I need to warn, it is not again a panacea for everything that we do. We are, however, and I predict that the world 5 years from now of the intelligence community will be somewhere operating in an arena of what I called object-based intelligence. This is the idea that the object that you are seeking to pursue in terms of understanding and knowledge of becomes the purpose against which you're collecting the information. And I think that, again, will speak to this integration of information, but it will also, within large amounts of information, be able to understand what the significance of that is. So think of it as a map that on top of that you start to layer on additional information and data pertaining to what's on that map.
Interesting. You had also talked about sort of DIA's efforts in terms of understanding foreign military services and things like that. One of the kind of threats on the horizon is obviously the cybersecurity threat, and I'm wondering what your sense is in terms of what the information you're able to provide policymakers to explain, in the case of China, what's the Chinese military up to? Why have we seen this increase in attacks? It's obviously become an object of increasing concern for the administration. So there does seem to be some sort of shift here. What does that mean?
For DIA, its role in all source intelligence analysis is to be able to provide that policymaker, that combatant commander, that decision maker, the knowledge of command and control in the cyber arena, its ability to understand long-term objectives and attribution associated with cyber in the context of that country's, or non-state actors, I might add, plans and intentions. And to that end, one of the things that Mike and I are doing with Keith Alexander and Chris Inglis with NSA, and then alongside of that with Cyber Command, is placing more and more of our analysts embedded inside the NSA and Cyber Command structure, which is back to my point of bringing the operators and collectors side by side with the analysts. What I don't want to think is as a model of a future is where I'm waiting for NSA and Cyber Command to come to DIA with all the necessary requisite information for analysis, and guess what? They never show up with that. And so to that end, I want those analysts that I have side by side embedded with the NSA and Cyber Command operators.
So in the case of China, what can you say about what the recent experience suggests about the intentions of the Chinese military?
They have every intention to get everything they can from us.
To what end?
I think they have several objectives. One is it clearly gives us in a cyber-centric world an advantage if they're able to collect it. So it's knowledge. Secondly, if it pertains to research and development, if they can avoid having to invest in it and collect it by other means, cyber in this case, it would be to that end as well. And I think it's simply raised in terms of their understanding of the future, like ours, that the cyber domain is here to stay, and our ability to defend it is inextricably linked to understanding what the United States is doing in the case of China, but it would apply to certainly other countries as well.
Staying on the technology topic, I'm not going to completely let you off the hook in terms of questions related to Edward Snowden, but in deference to everybody who's already heard a lot of conversations about this, I thought we wouldn't have that dominate the discussion.
Thank you.
But I am curious, particularly from DIA's perspective, are you concerned that he had access to systems that went beyond that of NSA? Because, as you know, there's been a big movement post 9/11 to have all these systems better connected. Is that a concern for you?
That issue, well beyond Snowden, is a concern of mine all the time. As we know from the 9/11 Commission, one of its crucial fundamental findings was the absence of information sharing, and ergo from that the responsibility to share. And so as you appropriately point out, the idea of common networks and common databases in which accessibility on the basis of that responsibility to share is been something that we have been working on. In the specifics of Snowden, I simply don't know the answer. I'm not an expert in networks, but it is obviously, until we know the full story behind what he might have gained access as a high-end system administrator, of course I'm concerned.
I just didn't know if that was something that you were looking at. I mean, I would imagine, anybody who was sort of responsible for the network of an intelligence agency might. Is that something that you're looking at?
Well, as the agency that hosted the WikiLeaks task force, and upon my arrival about 3 years ago, was deeply involved in that. I can tell you that every intelligence community and other partners associated with us abroad as well need to have some degree of concern.
Putting on your policy hat, with the Snowden leaks, there's obviously been a renewed interest in questions of government surveillance, and you went through the 2008 debate over surveillance law and what limits should and shouldn't be put on that. I'm wondering, given sort of the current renewed interest, are you surprised that this has become an issue again? I mean, what accounts for it?
I hear two questions there. Am I surprised, and what accounts for it? No, I'm not surprised at all by it. And this may surprise the room. I actually think it's healthy. I think the debate on those types of issues is a healthy thing. And it points to a more profound issue, and that's the issue of the balance of the civil liberties and our rights and to access to information. And I think this debate is going to go on in perpetuity. There may be catalysts that create a spike in the debate, but I think it is a healthy debate to have, because as the old story of the pizza guy calling up your house that has already knows what your order is and all the rest that goes with it, is that we are in a world today in where there is an ability to live in the cyber domain in such a way that protecting and access to information is in constant tension.
I think I'll open it up to the floor. Does anyone have a question? Mark?
Thanks. Mark Mazzetti with the New York Times. David, on the Syria opposition, you said that left unchecked, you saw that the more radical elements of the opposition would have a greater role in the opposition. And I'm wondering how, I mean, these are supposedly the guys on the good side, right? So how do you put them in check? Are you talking about just strengthening the more secular elements of the opposition, or do you actually have to sort of take these more radical groups head on?
Yes. No, I think it's too simple to say it's one or the other. It's the reality that left unchecked, they will become bigger. And look, it's very clear that over the last 2 years they've grown in size, they've grown in capabilities, and ruthlessly have grown in effectiveness. And their ability to take the fight to the regime and Hezbollah in a very direct way has been, among those opposition groups, the most effective ones. I would posit they will not go home when it's over. And as a result, I believe that the fall of the Bashar regime and potentially going to the northwest or leaving altogether, killed, whatever it might be, is they will fight for that space. They're there for the long haul. So it is, and it's really then at that point a policy call. What level of risk do you take in working back from that in terms of the support to other elements that may abut to that extreme end of it, all the way to those whose grievances are different, but is very disparate.
Going off of that for 1 minute, what then does a post-Assad Syria look like to you in terms of the power dynamics at that point?
Probably a continuation of a civil war of Sunni Shia. I think a bitter fight orchestrated in part from Tehran, in part from Nasrallah and Hezbollah in Lebanon, where I believe Nasrallah is committed today where he didn't think he'd be committed even 6 months ago in terms of the Hezbollah aspect. But I do not believe that Iran feels it can lose that territory.
Yes.
Gail Harris with the Foreign Policy Association. My question concerns the continuing intelligence education of intelligence analysts. I'm a retired naval intelligence officer, and it was not uncommon for, if you did well one assignment, I might be in Central America, and the next assignment I'm in the Middle East. And although I was educated by the University of Denver, and I must say very well, there was no plan in place or no career track where I could gain a geographic or regional expertise. Your boss, General Flynn, wrote a great paper a couple of years ago saying that while the military intelligence community provided great support for things like IEDs, but there was a major shortfall in understanding the political, economic, and social dynamics of a region, and that was just as important to success of operations as the more traditional roles. So my question is, what type of actions have you all been taking to correct this problem?
Let me start with the latter part of your question in terms of what I would hear as social cultural understanding. I think I failed to mention that was clearly one of the lessons learned out of the past decade, is that our ability to understand the nature of the problem is contextualized by understanding the societal, linguistic, and other aspects of that social cultural setting in which it's found. The intelligence agency, and I'm looking at John McLaughlin as a longtime veteran on the analytics side, has long struggled with striking the balance between subject matter expertise and generic tradecraft knowledge. The training today is trying to strike the balance somewhere in the middle. But what I can tell you is that what I've observed over the last 2.5 years at DIA is that I have had less than adequate number of analysts with deep expertise on where these crises have emerged, which now are the normal as opposed to status quo ante of that crisis, of where I have taken analysts away from areas of expertise that they did not have against what they're dealing with today. And it's complemented by some additional training and deep knowledge. But we all know, as a Latin Americanist myself, I can tell you that that's not the same thing. And I think that's where trying to strike the balance to which you refer to in terms of deep knowledge with tradecraft expertise in being a good analyst and taking those lessons learned of 9/11 and certainly of the WMD Commission and those 72 recommendations made in that report and applying those is where the tension rests.
Jane?
Hi, Jane Harmon. David, I applaud your view that there should be dissents as part of in national intelligence estimates. I think it's hard to predict what will happen, and if there's only consensus, that dumbs it down to the least common denominator. And I've noticed, at least from my reading, that the best NIEs have dissents. They also have what I call book reviews, outside evaluators saying what they think. My question is this: consistent with your view that there needs to be enhanced public understanding and debate to the extent that some of this information can be shared, how important is it to put a declassified summary on top of NIEs, and how difficult is it to prepare one that accurately reflects, consistent with leaving out what has to be classified, the substance of the report?
You probably won't like the answer, but it depends. It depends what the national intelligence estimate topic is. I still read and review NIEs that are highly restrictive even within the community because of how sensitive they are in terms of the dependencies on the collection means or the content of that collection. All the way to ones that, frankly, to your question, are somewhat social cultural in where goeth the region on this or something like that. When President Bush made his decision on the famous Iran NIE, I was there and in making him making that decision. I was not a part of the decision. He felt he owed the American people, because of the debate that had been going on the Iran nuclear program and that updated assessment of it in 2008, that there ought to be a unclassified version of that, and clearly it spurred a lot of debate. Long-winded answer to saying, I think that's something the President and the Hill leadership and the intelligence community leadership ought to have a real discussion about. But again, they're not all the same. I wouldn't want to say 100% it would be right, and I would certainly never say that none of them would it ever work, because some of them are quite benign and would inform debate. Yeah. But they'd all inform debate, but you wouldn't want certain parts of what it reveals in terms of that.
Hi, Phil Stewart from Reuters. Getting back to Syria for a second, given the trajectory that you see that country on, and the risks of inaction, what do you think the time frame is to provide some sort of additional support for opposition groups that are not extremist?
I was one of those who subscribed. I almost said few, but I think there were quite a few. But I certainly was one of those that never thought Bashar Assad was going to fall within the first 6 months to a year. And DIA's position was that it was certainly no earlier than the start of this year, and it's obviously not happened. My concern is that it could go on for a long time, as in many months to multiple years. And the civilian casualties, the enormous flow of refugees, and the dislocation and so forth, and the human suffering associated with it will only increase in time. And in large measure, a stalemate, absent an exogenous variable that changes it, and I frankly don't see an endogenous one inside Syria doing so.
Yes, sir. Oh, yeah, Richard. Oh, well, it's fine.
It's a quick question. My name is Paul Nicholas, and my question is this. About 3 years ago, the defense bill gave DIA some new authorities to look at threats to ICT supply chain risk. I was wondering if you could talk to us a little bit about the progress of developing that threat analysis capability, perhaps concerns that you're seeing in commercial ICT products, and to what degree you're working with the private sector on that.
I'm generally an optimist. In the supply chain area, I'm very concerned of the world of you don't know what you don't know. I mean, it comes as no surprise. And the old adage of the weakest link obviously being what you need to be most concerned about. The analysis, having just recently been briefed on some very phenomenal work that's being done by our counterintelligence experts, and it crosses the services. It's not just DIA at Quantico. And looking at that is tremendous success. But I sense a little bit that it's insufficient from the standpoint, again, on the larger understanding and effort. Our adversaries are very active in trying to introduce material into the supply chain in ways that threaten our security from the standpoint of their abilities to collect or disrupt, as the case may be. From the private sector standpoint, we get tremendous cooperation. I think the challenge there is how do we apply that knowledge into racking and stacking the risks associated with where we put our resources. Again, it's an area where I have a significant number of analytic resources attached to it. It is still less than adequate in my personal view, and I'm trying to do something about that in a time of fiscal austerity and all the rest, because I'm trading it off with other mission, but a critical mission.
Great. Well, we have time for a couple more. We'll first go with the one that was.
Hello, David. Maurice Sonnenberg.
Hello.
My question, back in 1947, there was a man named Ferdinand Eberstadt who was responsible for setting up the National Security Act, to which he had said basically that intelligence is the sine qua non to us being able to advance and protect our nation. Now, what I'm concerned about is sequester. And in sequester, I'm afraid that you, your agency, and the intelligence community as a whole, furloughs, layoffs, could you discuss that in terms of your concerns about that?
Yeah, I will say of this what I can say publicly. If I could only get flexibility in administering the sequester, that would be wonderful. Today, it is a fair cut, fair share, cut across every one of my programs. And that makes no sense to me. It's not allowing real conscious decision of where I am prepared to take risk in mission versus where I maybe even in terms of supply chain may actually increase it. Not only not cut it, but not increase it. And we have not received that flexibility in terms of the sequester. I don't believe that strategically as not only limited to the agency of DIA, but but as an intelligence community that has to take another 10% out of the fiscal 14 budget, which begins, subject of course to a continuing resolution and a budget, on 1 October of this year, 10% that cuts across evenly from my garage construction at one end of the spectrum and my Iran mission makes no sense at all to me. That is the more painful part of it. I have budget lines that are essentially almost entirely civilian pay, of where again I don't have the flexibility separate and apart from furloughs, because I cannot make inside that particular project line any other decision because I have to find 10% in it. So that's what I will say about sequester.
We have time for one or two more, depending on how quick the answers are. Admiral Blair, and if we have time, we'll go to David.
David, we've addressed this question of what does the Snowden and before them the WikiLeaks events mean to intelligence sharing, something that you and I have worked very hard on in prior lives. We've heard a range of opinions. We've gone too far. We need to go back to tighter classifications. That was from Ash Carter. Keith Alexander said, if we go to the cloud, that will make it a lot better. If you can, I think it's be worth talking a little bit about the status of the Intelligence Library Initiative, which was a very disciplined, very careful attempt to gain the advantages of sharing while putting in very tight systems of control, including system administrators, including authorization of users, including the technical underpinnings of it, which would allow the right people to have access to all of the right analysis and eventually collection to do it. And if you could give us an update on that. Also in this area of the sort of underneath the hood nitty-gritty business of intelligence integration that the IRTPA Act has fostered, the concept of mission management has been one of the real important breakthroughs, I think, in terms of just raising our game across the board against tough problems in intelligence. And that, I know that Jim Clapper has continued the initiatives that some of his predecessors began. And if to the extent that you can, I think it's worth telling people about how that is really helping us work against the really toughest challenges that we face. Thanks.
Sure. Let me start with your second question and very briefly say, Jim Clapper has taken the concept of mission manager and applied it to a higher execution standard by bringing the collectors and analysts together in identifying where those gaps are and how to address those gaps. And that's essentially where we're driving DIA as an agency by creating 4 geographic centers in which the collectors sit side by side with the mission managers, with the analysts, so that it is a mission management construct. I believe it is part of the future, and it's back to the lessons learned of this integration between the collectors and the analysts. To your first question, I would sincerely hope that regardless of what has recently occurred, we do not go backwards on information sharing. That would do enormous damage to the significant steps taken over the past decade and the lessons learned from 9/11, foreign and domestic in terms of the 9/11 events of 2001, all the way to the lessons learned from Iraq WMD. That said, I do believe there is a concept of continuous evaluation in which, for example, the National Library of Intelligence allows you to monitor then how the information is accessed and what is done with that information in terms of passing it to the left or right, outside of the bounds, again, of how that individual should be behaving, and being able, through identity management, to be able to do that better. I know I'm out of time.
I know. Unfortunately, do we have time for one? No, we don't. I'm
No.
sorry. But you can hit David up after the session. Thank you so much. I'm sorry I couldn't get to all the
Thank you.
questions.